Thank you for joining us this evening for this informational webinar hosted by the Michigan PTA with Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews on debunking the myths about critical race theory, also referred to as CRT. My name is Karen Meyer. I'll be moderating this webinar this evening with Shireen Nathan. I am the Northfield Public Schools Council PTA's Advocacy Chair, the Federal Legislative Chair for the Michigan PTA. I'm a Director on the Michigan PTA Board, and I'm an Advocacy Committee member. Shireen is the Detroit Public Schools Consolidated District Field Service Representative and also Director on the Michigan PTA Board and an Advocacy Committee member. We're honored tonight to have Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews joining us to share her time and expertise. She is the chairperson for the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. She's a professor of race, culture, and equity. Her research is broadly focused on racial justice and educational equity. She examines issues of racial justice in preschool through 12th grade learning contexts and on college campuses. She's given 2 TEDx talks. Before we get started on the questions this evening, I would like to direct you to a couple resources relevant to this discussion. The National PTA Statement on CRT and Inclusive Practices in Schools can be found at pta.org on their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion page. And Michigan PTA's position on inclusive practices in schools can be found at Michigan PTA under our Diversity and Equity Inclusion tab. Both actually, the National PTA and Michigan PTA statements can be found on the Michigan PTA website, but both websites are great resources for information. We'll be asking a wide variety of questions tonight that we hope you'll find informative and illuminating. However, if you have a question we did not get to, or you have a follow-up, please put your question in the question answer with your email. That way, if time allows, we'll be able to answer it tonight. But if not, we can get back to you in the near future. Shireen, if you could take the first question. Oh, sorry. Shireen, do you want to unmute yourself and take the first question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Shireen seems to be having some technical issues, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Dr. Carter Andrews, what is critical race theory, also known as CRT?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak on this topic for the Michigan PTA. So I'll just start by saying critical race theory is really a framework. A theoretical framework that was developed in the 1970s by legal scholars. And those scholars at the time were arguing that this concept of white supremacy maintains power through the law and other legal systems. And really CRT dismisses the idea that racism stems from individual acts of people, but rather that it's rooted in a system of oppression that's based on racial hierarchy. And it just so happens that, Karen, that racial hierarchy has whites at the top, and whites reap material benefits over people of color, really resulting from a misuse of power. So that's kind of a a large overview around CRT. I think the other thing I'll say for those who are just trying to understand what is this framework, the framework assumes that racism is a permanent part of American society. It doesn't mean we can't abolish racism, but that it's there. It's like the air that we breathe or the smog in the air. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to be working to abolish racism in all areas of our life.
Thank you. So I think you answered some of this in the previous question, but could you elaborate on what is the history of critical race theory?
Yeah, absolutely. So, some people might think CRT started in education. It did not. As I said, back in the early 70s, there were legal scholars in higher education who were using, trying to conceptualize a framework to argue systemic and institutional racism existed in legal systems and in laws and policies. And so, this core idea really was that race is a social construct, and but race acts out in ways that have institutional and structural negative impact, particularly on marginalized racial groups, African Americans and other people of color. This legal analysis, went on into the early 1980s, and then this concept, this theory was being taught in law schools, at colleges and universities, primarily to graduate students. And then fast forward to 1995, some education scholars in higher education grabbed onto the theory and said, hey, we can use this framework to actually analyze and understand how racism operates in K-12 schools. So really, CRT was not introduced to the field of education until 1995.
Thank you. I just want to point out, we seem to have lost Shereen Nathan. Hopefully it sounds like she's having some technical difficulties, so hopefully she'll be able to join us again soon. I'm going to continue with the questions while we work. So I know you, again, in the last question, you did speak to this, but if you could further, how does this history relate to K-12 education?
Absolutely. So, I'll just restate that, the theory was kind of introduced to the field of education in 1995 by Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate. And some of your audience members might be familiar with Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is a prominent education scholar, particularly around the topic of culturally relevant teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy. So they wrote a paper in 1995, and various fields of education and higher ed begin to say, hey, now we've got this framework that helps us really think about how issues of racism historically have plagued K-12 education. And so I'll just give a little backdrop for that, right? We know in the United States, schools have been historically segregated. We know that. Initially in our country, some parents may not know this, but historically, before there was compulsory public education, only well-to-do white men could go to school, right? So if we think about schooling in the US, it was never available to everyone, okay? And so then post-emancipation, the country really was forced to construct an educational system that could accommodate not only white boys, but also white girls and newly freed African Americans. So I really want people to think about that. In the United States, we started with an educational system that was only designed for white, well-to-do boys. So right there you have racial bias and you have gender bias. And then we had to move on post emancipation to construct a system that could accommodate many more. You fast forward, Karen, we know that the South and the North and other regions of our country dealt with race and racial groups differently in schools. We know that in the South, there was Jim Crow segregation, pre-Brown versus Board of Education. And so again, here we can use CRT as a lens to help us understand how segregated schooling for Black children and other children of color had a persistent and systemic negative impact on those children as Southern states were slow to desegregate, slow to integrate. What CRT does is provide us a frame for talking to each other as adults about that and for talking with young people about that. That's not a part of our history that we want to hide from them, but they need tools to think about how racial bias systematically and over long periods of time disadvantaged children and families of color. So CRT just is a tool to help examine that particular issue. So I use segregation as an example. Karen, if you'll allow me, I'll just give a couple other examples about how CRT relates to the history of K-12 education. So if we think about things like the inequities in school funding, we know, I'm not making this up, we know that schools where there are majority Black and brown children have less funding than schools in suburban, predominantly white communities. How does that happen, right? And how does that persist decade after decade? Some parents might be familiar with redlining as a practice, an institutional practice that led to that type of unequal funding. We also know that children of color have less access to AP courses and college prep courses and gifted and talented programming. How does that happen? Is it that they're just not as smart? People who utilize CRT would say, no, that's not really the issue. Through implicit bias and explicit bias, there are ways in which individuals are systematically disadvantaged from being placed in advanced placement courses and gifted and talented programs.
Thank you. Nancy Jennings, I might ask you if you, fellow PTA member from Farmington Hills, if you would mind unmuting yourself, since we're unable to get Shereen Nathan back at this time, if you want to help me moderate the questions. Do you want to take the next question, Nancy, or do you want me to go ahead with it?
Absolutely, I can take that next question.
Sorry, just let me. Sorry, I'm having some issues. It's not letting me, not letting me go to the next one. There we go. Okay, there you go.
Is CRT being taught in Michigan's public school classrooms? If it is, what might it look like?
Thanks for that question, Nancy. So I'll start out by saying I am not aware of any Michigan school or classroom where the framework is being explicitly taught to youth and adolescents. I don't know of a teacher or a school administrator who's saying, let's teach the framework to young people. But I will say there are likely teachers in classrooms across Michigan who are familiar with the framework, right? In part because of this debate that has now, been a part of public discourse for several months now, almost a year. It's led teachers to want to Google and go to Amazon and buy books to read about what is CRT. And there may be some teachers who studied critical race theory in their teacher prep program. But I would venture to say that most of our teachers in Michigan did not study critical race theory in their teacher preparation program because CRT is not widely taught in teacher preparation programs. So the short answer to that is no, I'm not aware, but I don't want to be definitive, right? I will say, though, that teachers who know about critical race theory might be using its tenets to guide or inform the way they approach teaching and learning and the types of curricular choices they make, right? Including what types of reading materials they use in the classroom, or videos or movies, or what guest speakers they invite to talk to their students, what field trips they take. They may be thinking about or informed by how they understand the framework. I will say what is happening in public school classrooms across the state of Michigan is teachers are engaging students in discussions about fairness, equality, equity, discrimination, and bias. But Nancy, these are topics that teachers have always been discussing with young people in school. This is nothing new, right? But gender equity, classism, ableism, homophobia, xenophobia, these are all forms of discrimination that impact people of color. And so when a teacher uses a critical race theory framing for these discussions, either implicitly or explicitly, they're just simply trying to highlight the ways that people in dominant societal groups, like whites, men, high-income people, able-bodied individuals, people who were born in this country, systematically benefit from cultural norms that people of color don't, right? So again, this is not work that teachers haven't been doing for decades. It's just the public discourse has elevated this particular lens as one that should be scary, and we need to resist it because it's meant to make white people feel guilty about themselves. And that's not really the focus of critical race theory.
Is critical race theory related to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Karen, that's a great question. I would say it is. I mean, when we think about education, if you are of the mindset that racism is a permanent part of our society, then you are also of the mindset that we have to keep working to secure equity in schools. We have to keep working to be inclusive. So it's related to DEI in that, again, it is a lens through which we can develop DEI initiatives and then implement them in ways that really serve the students and communities that are disproportionately negatively affected. But again, they are not the same. Diversity centers on recognizing and valuing people's differences. Equity centers on providing all children with equal access to the same opportunities. And inclusion centers on integrating multiple perspectives and experiences into the daily functions of what's happening in schools. Well, how is CRT related to that? Again, it's an umbrella frame that helps us think about How do we make our schools more diverse? How do we achieve equity among racial and ethnic groups in schools? And how do we ensure that we're inclusive of the various life experiences and cultural backgrounds of kids in schools?
There is a perception that DEI or SEL, which is social emotional learning, for those of you who want to know what the alphabet soup means, programs and or curriculums are actually CRT initiatives. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, I would say critical race theory's primary initiative, if you want to say that the theory has an initiative, is that we need to end racism, period, right? Like that's CRT's initiative, if we want to use that framing. Social emotional learning is something completely different from that, right? Social emotional learning is about attending to the overall well-being of the whole child, understanding the ways in which our emotions, our mental health, our psychological health impact our ability to learn in the classroom. Do kids of different racial groups experience emotional trauma differently? Sure. Interact with peer groups differently? Sure. Because relationships are cultural, interpersonal relationships are cultural. If we think about a CRT framing on social emotional learning programs, the argument would be that any social emotional learning program or initiative needs to equitably account for meeting the needs of kids of various racial ethnic groups, that you can't have a one-size-fits-all intervention and expect it to meet the needs of all kids. Why? Because kids come to school with different cultural backgrounds and lived experiences that are shaped by society's ways of responding to and interacting with their communities. So in those ways, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social emotional learning are related to critical race theory, but they're not initiatives of critical race theory. A theory can't have initiatives. A theory is a frame or lens through which to examine the world.
You spoke of this a little bit. Oh. You spoke about this a little bit earlier in one of your answers about the perception that critical race theory is divisive and designed to make people feel guilty about their racial identity or identify as oppressor or oppressed, and that also indoctrinates students. Could you tell us about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, I'll do the best I can to answer it briefly, because I think you could do an entire webinar on this. But again, the concepts of oppressor and oppressed come out of higher education, academia. That is also a framework, right, by which to understand issues of culture, power, and difference in society. When we think about oppressor and oppressed through a racial lens, I'm going to go back to the hierarchy. If you think of a pyramid, there's a racial hierarchy in our society, right? There is. Whites are at the top. People of color subsequently are subordinate. Quite honestly, many would argue with Black folks at the bottom of that hierarchy. And so in that framing, in a racial hierarchy framing, the oppressed are those who have had the power to disadvantage others, right? at a community or systems level, the oppressor, right? So in that framework, the notion is not to say white people are bad, but that the logics that hold up and maintain white supremacist ideals are bad. And white people, because they are white, benefit from the ideals of white supremacy. People of color don't in the same way. So in the oppressor-oppressed framework, the oppressed, members of the oppressed group have either actively or passively participated in systems that continue to marginalize people of color. Just for a minute, Karen, I'd say, think about this through a gender lens, oppressor and oppressed. In our society, right, many would say we live in a patriarchal system. So in that framework, men would be the oppressor, women would be the oppressed, right? Does that make men bad people? No, but they use their male privilege either knowingly or unknowingly to consistently and systematically oppress women. We could talk about the gender pay gap. We could talk about women's rights to their own bodies, who gets to make decisions, right? So I want you all to leave here understanding oppressor oppressed is a framing around what groups in our society have power and what groups are marginalized. When you look at gender, men have power, women are marginalized. When you look at race, whites have power, people of color are marginalized. So it's a framing.
What are your thoughts on why these perceptions exist?
I think they present, well, they exist because inherently we live in a country, right, that is built on inequity. I mean, the genocide of Native people, how ironic that we're having this webinar on Indigenous Peoples Day, or what some still call Columbus Day. That right there is a framing, right? Did Columbus find America? That's a lens. Or were Native people already here and this was their land, right? Depending on which perception you carry forward in your life, that writes the narrative of not just US history, but how you think about Native peoples and their power, agency, or subjugation, and how you think about whites. So these perceptions exist, Nancy, because we as individuals hold on to certain narratives and the way the world has been explained to us that is not a complete accounting. Same is true for schooling, which is why I started with who were schools meant for in our country originally.
There's been increased discussion around CRT with legislative bills being introduced in Michigan that would make it illegal to teach any form of race or gender stereotyping, anything that could be understood as implicit race or gender stereotyping. If these laws were enacted, what is the classroom impact?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. I mean, I think what you're gonna see over time is an eroding of the teacher workforce. We already have a teacher shortage. If legislation tries to once again, legislate what teachers are able to do in the classroom, you will see some additional exiting, right? That does not serve our kids well. It doesn't, because our kids are already disadvantaged by not having access to high quality teachers. So we don't want these bills to pass because teaching is a profession. And if we see it as a profession and educators as professionals, we ought to trust that they are experts in their field and that they know how to engage young people in critical dialogue, problem solving, and critical thinking skills around America's history, but also America's current and America's future. If we don't allow teachers to do that, we are actually eroding our democracy because we're not preparing young people to be the kinds of citizens who can engage in ways that make our world more just, more equitable, and more fair in the future.
PTA is committed to advocating for inclusive K-12 curricula and multicultural resources to empower students and families of all backgrounds. What steps can be taken to help these efforts?
I think it's a great question, Nancy. I think the Parent-Teacher Association can be reaching out to universities, to colleges of education, to programs of teacher education. I think there has to be more partnership and communication and dialogue between parent groups and colleges and universities, right? There's a wealth of knowledge and resources in these institutions that are research-based, right? So if parents want to grab on to resources, you got faculty and scholars in higher education who are coming up with research-based tools and strategies. The other thing I'd say alongside that, Nancy, is look to community organizers and elders, that there is a kind of expert origin knowledge in communities that parents often overlook in terms of finding curricula and multicultural resources to empower students.
How can PTAs help navigate this evening's topics in our community so that we can move forward to benefit students?
Great question, Karen. I think you can hold more community forums among parents. I think so many parents are ill-informed, miseducated, caught up in the myths that they don't have the proper information, not only about critical race theory, but other aspects of like school that would help them navigate the process. But the more parent associations can hold community forums that include, right, informed, knowledgeable folk, the more you can dispel myths, help people understand the truth. It doesn't mean we're always gonna agree, but then at least you can base your positions on factual information and not opinions and not the media. The media is not the best source for learning about academic topics because it often gets politicized. And talking about racial justice, gender justice, you know, any kind of social justice should not be a political issue. It's a human issue. And that's what we want young people to understand and advocate for.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carter Andrews, as well as Nancy Jennings for stepping in. I really appreciate both of your time this evening. Unfortunately, it looks like we went a little bit over the time. I appreciate all the wonderful answers to the questions. And if anyone submitted a question, please please include your email and then we can get back to you with, hopefully we can help you with that. I had a little bit of an issue clicking back and forth with questions, so I apologize for the change in visual. I just wanted to remind before we close out this evening that the Michigan PTA, National PTA, and all PTAs are nonpartisan 501c3s. And I just wanted to leave once again our contact information. If you have any future questions, you can always reach out to Shireen or myself, and for sure call the Michigan PTA. Someone will answer this and questions related to tonight's webinar or any future questions that you may have. So we really appreciate you lending your expertise to us tonight, Dr. Carter Andrews, and I appreciate anyone who spent their time with us this evening for this very important conversation. So I just wanted to thank you once again. It's really valuable for our membership and our PTA as a whole. So
Thanks, Karen, for having me.
yes. I hope everyone has a good evening and a good week. Thank you again.